Fragments of Book XL. Marcus Antonius came to terms with the Cretans, and for a while they observed the peace. Later, however, when the question was brought forward how they might best look to their own advantage, the oldest men and the most prudent counseled them to send an embassy to Rome to offer a defense against the crimes imputed to them, and to attempt by fair words and petitions to appease the Senate. Accordingly, they dispatched 30 of their most eminent men as ambassadors. These men, by going about individually to the houses of the senators and voicing every possible plea for mercy, won over the pillars of the Senate. Brought before the Senate itself, they argued their case discreetly and enumerated in detail their good services to the ruling power and the military support they had rendered it. This said, they called upon the senators to restore them to favor and re-establish the alliance that had existed earlier. The Senate, giving their explanations a ready welcome, attempted to pass a decree wherein they absolved the Cretans of the offences charged against them and proclaimed them friends and allies of the state. But Lentulus, surnamed Spinther, vetoed the measure. Thereupon the Cretans departed. The Senate, upon being informed time after time that the Cretans were in league with the pirates and sharing the booty, decreed that the Cretans should send to Rome all their ships, even to those of only 4 oars, should furnish 300 hostages, all men of great prominence, should hand over Lasthenes and Panares, and should pay jointly an indemnity of 4,000 talents in silver. When the Cretans learned of the senatorial decisions, they met to deliberate on the news. The more prudent said that they ought to comply with all the demands, but Lasthenes and his supporters, being liable to conviction on these charges, and fearing that if they were sent to Rome they would be punished, stirred up the populace with exhortations to preserve the liberty handed down to them from time immemorial. Certain of the Antiochians, emboldened against King Antiochus as a result of his defeat, stirred up the populace and proposed that he be banished from the city. There was a great uprising, but when the king prevailed, the ringleaders of the sedition fled in alarm from Syria. Gathering in Cilicia, they proposed to restore Philip, one son of the Philip, whose father was Antiochus Grypus. Philip proved receptive to the proposal and arranged a meeting with Azizus the Arab, who gave him a ready welcome, set a diadem on his head, and restored him to the kingship. Orneb, pinning all his hopes on the alliance with Sampsiceramus, sent for him to come with his army. He, however, having made a secret agreement with Azizus to do away with the kings, came with his army and summoned Antiochus to his presence. When the king, knowing nothing of this, complied, Sampsiceramus acted the part of a friend, but placed him under arrest, and though for the time being he merely held him closely guarded in chains, he later had him put to death. So too, in accordance with the agreement to divide up the kingdom of Syria, Azizus intended to assassinate Philip, but Philip got wind of the plot and fled to Antioch. 2. During Pompey's stay in Damascus of Syria, Aristobulus, the king of the Jews, and Hyrcanus his brother came to him with their dispute over the kingship. Likewise, the leading men, more than 200 in number, gathered to address the general and explained that their forefathers, having revolted from Demetrius, had sent an embassy to the Senate and received from them the leadership of the Jews, who were, moreover, to be free and autonomous, their ruler being called high priest, not king. Now, however, these men were lording it over them, having overthrown the ancient laws and enslaved the citizens in defiance of all justice. For it was by means of a horde of mercenaries, and by outrages and countless impious murders that they had established themselves as kings. Pompey put off till a later occasion the settlement of their rival claims, but as to the lawless behavior of the Jews and the wrongs committed against the Romans, he bitterly upbraided the party of Hyrcanus. They deserved, he said, some graver and harsher visitation. Nevertheless, in the spirit of Rome's traditional clemency, he would, if they were obedient henceforward, grant them pardon. 3. Now that we are about to record the war against the Jews, we consider it appropriate to give first a summary account of the establishment of the nation, from its origins and of the practices observed among them. When in ancient times a pestilence arose in Egypt, the common people ascribed their troubles to the workings of a divine agency. For indeed, with many strangers of all sorts dwelling in their midst and practicing different rites of religion and sacrifice, their own traditional observances in honor of the gods had fallen into disuse. Hence the natives of the land surmised that unless they removed the foreigners, their troubles would never be resolved. At once, therefore, the aliens were driven from the country, and the most outstanding and active among them banded together and, as some say, were cast ashore in Greece and certain other regions. Their leaders were notable men, chief among them being Danaes and Cadmus. But the greater number were driven into what is now called Judea, which is not far distant from Egypt and was at that time utterly uninhabited. The colony was headed by a man called Moses, outstanding both for his wisdom and for his courage. On taking possession of the land he founded, besides other cities, one that is now the most renowned of all, called Jerusalem. In addition, he established the temple that they hold in chief veneration, instituted their forms of worship and ritual, drew up their laws and ordered their political institution. He also divided them into 12 tribes, since this is regarded as the most perfect number and corresponds to the number of months that make up a year. But he had no images whatsoever of the gods made for them, being of the opinion that God is not in human form. Rather, the heaven that surrounds the earth is alone divine and rules the universe. The sacrifices that he established differ from those of other nations, as does their way of living, for, as a result of their own expulsion from Egypt, he introduced an unsocial and intolerant mode of life. He picked out the men of most refinement and with the greatest ability to head the entire nation and appointed them priests, and he ordained that they should occupy themselves with the temple and the honors and sacrifices offered to their God. These same men he appointed to be judges in all major disputes and entrusted to them the guardianship of the laws and custom. For this reason, the Jews never have a king, and authority over the people is regularly vested in whichever priest is regarded as superior to his colleagues in wisdom and virtue. They call this man the high priest, and believe that he acts as a messenger to them of God's commandments. It is he, we are told, who in their assemblies and other gatherings announces what is ordained, and the Jews are so docile in such matters that straightway they fall to the ground and do reverence to the high priest when he expounds the commandments to them. And at the end of their laws there is even appended the statement, "These are the words that Moses heard from God and declares unto the Jews." Their lawgiver was careful also to make provision for warfare, and required the young men to cultivate manliness, steadfastness, and, generally, the endurance of every hardship. He led out military expeditions against the neighboring tribes, and after annexing much land apportioned it out, assigning equal allotments to private citizens and greater ones to the priests, in order that they, by virtue of receiving more ample revenues, might be undistracted and apply themselves continually to the worship of God. The common citizens were forbidden to sell their individual plots, lest there be some who for their own advantage should buy them up, and by oppressing the poorer classes bring on a scarcity of manpower. He required those who dwelt in the land to rear their children, and since offspring could be cared for at little cost, the Jews were from the start a populous nation. As to marriage and the burial of the dead, he saw to it that their customs should differ widely from those of other men. But later, when they became subject to foreign rule, as a result of their mingling with men of other nations, both under Persian rule and under that of the Macedonians who overthrew the Persians, many of their traditional practices were disturbed. Such is the account of Hecataeus of Abdera in regard to the Jews. 4. Pompey had inscribed on a tablet, which he 61 Pio set up as a dedication, the record of his achievements in Asia. Here's a copy of the inscription: Pompey the great son of Gnaeus, Imperator, having liberated the seacoast of the inhabited world and all islands this side ocean from the war with the pirates, being likewise the man who delivered from siege the kingdom of Ariobarzanes, Galatia, and the lands and provinces lying beyond it, Asia and Bithynia, who gave protection to Paphlagonia and Pontus, Armenia and Achaia, as well as Iberia, Colchis, Mesopotamia, Sophane, and Gordian, brought into subjection Darius king of the Medes, Artoles king of the Iberians, Aristobulus king of the Jews, Aretas king of the Jews, Aretas king of the Nabatean Arabs, Syria bordering on Cilicia, Judea, Arabia, the province of Cyrene, the Achaeans, the Iozygi, the Soani, the Heniochi, and the other tribes along the seacoast between Colchis and the Maeotic Sea, with their kings, 9 in number, and all the nations that dwell between the Pontic and the Red Seas, extended the frontiers of the empire to the limits of the earth, and secured and in some cases increased the revenues of the Roman people. He, by confiscation of the statues and the images set up to the gods, as well as other valuables taken from the enemy, has dedicated to the goddess 12,060 pieces of gold and 307 talents of silver. 5. At Rome, a certain insolvent debtor named Catiline and Lentulus surnamed Sura gathered a mob and fomented sedition against the Senate as follows. A certain festival was approaching when it was customary for the clients of prominent men to send gifts, and for this reason houses were kept open all through the night. The conspirators agreed, therefore, to use this opportunity to introduce into the houses of their intended victims men, whose business it would be to lay violent hands upon them. With swords concealed at their girdles, they were to gain entry without rousing suspicion, ostensibly for the purpose of bringing gifts, and distributed a few to each house, at one and the same time, to do away with virtually the entire Senate. Though the plot had been thus carefully planned, by a miracle the victims escaped assassination. For among the more than 400 men who were detailed to do the killing, there was one who was in love with a certain girl and who, on being slighted by her, remarked more than once that within a few days her very life would be in his power. The remark puzzled her, and she could not guess what grounds he had for his threat, but still the young man remained insistent. When they were together, therefore, and drinking, she feigned extreme delight at his company, and asked him to tell her what in the world his remark meant, and he, wishing in his infatuation to please her, disclosed the whole truth. She pretended to have taken what was said sympathetically and joyfully, and held her peace, but on the morrow went to the wife of Cicero, the consul, and speaking privately with her about the matter reported what the young man had said. Thus was the conspiracy brought to light, and the consul, by using now threats and terror, now kindly exhortations, learned from them full details of the plot. 5. Lucius Sergius, surnamed Catiline, on finding himself deep in debt, had fomented an insurrection, and the consul Marcus Cicero was composing a speech on the anticipated disturbance. Catiline, on being openly named and accused to his face, declared that under no circumstances would he condemn himself to voluntary exile without a trial. Cicero put the question to the senators whether it was their wish to banish Catiline from the city. When the majority, abashed by the man's presence, remained silent, Cicero, wishing as it were to probe their sentiments exactly, turned the question and asked the senators next whether they would order him to banish Quintus Catullus from Rome, when with one voice they all shouted their disapproval and showed their displeasure at what was said. Cicero, reverting to Catiline, remarked that when they considered a man not deserving of banishment, they shouted with all their might. Hence, it was evident that by silence they were agreeing to his banishment. Catiline, after stating that he would think it over in private, withdrew. According to the proverb, the less is the enemy of the more. 6. This Cleopatra is mentioned by Virgil, Lucian, Galen, along with Plutarch, and by Diodorus and George the Chronicler, among others. 7. The beginning of the Gallic War, which we have made the end of our history. This part of the inhabited world and that about the British Isles and the Arctic regions have fallen least of all within the range of men's common knowledge. But as for the northern latitudes adjacent to the region that is uninhabited because of the cold, we shall discuss them when we come to write of the deeds of Gaius Caesar, for it was he who extended the Roman Empire farthest in that direction, and brought all the area that was previously unknown within the scope of history. In our own times Gaius Caesar, who by his deeds won the title Divus, was the first on record to have conquered the island, and by defeating the Britons in war compelled them to pay fixed tribute. But as for these matters, we shall record the particulars of his enterprise at the appropriate times. As for their customs and other peculiarities, we shall record them in detail when we come to Caesar's campaign against Britain. 8. Some of the books were pirated and published before being corrected and before they had received the finishing touches, at a time when we were not yet fully satisfied with the work. These we disown. But in order that these books, by getting before the public, may not mar the general plan of our history, we have deemed it necessary to publish a statement that will expose any misconception. Our subject matter is contained within 40 books, and in the first 6, we have recorded the events and legends prior to the Trojan War. In these, we have not fixed the dates with any precision, since no chronological record of them was at hand.